If you've been at OCF for very long, you know that we look at this as one big story. The Bible begins with the story, it ends with the story. It's just one whole story. If you look inside, depending on how you read the prophets, there's also a bunch of stories. In fact, some scholars say that 75% of what we read in here are stories. Think about the New Testament, the Gospels. We have 4 stories about Jesus, kind of told from different perspectives, but each of them tells a story. And even within the Gospels themselves, you have Jesus who taught mostly in stories. Sure, he had propositional truth and he directly addressed questions, but often even his answer to the questions that was being asked was a story. Jesus taught in stories. God's a fan of stories. Why is that? Why is story so important to the way God has revealed himself to us? And I think there's a lot of reasons, but 2 kind of stand out to me. One is stories are memorable, that we just remember stories. I remember when Esther, she was 5 years old and she swallowed a quarter. And so we had to go to the hospital, and it was a bad scene. It was stuck right in her throat. And we were waiting. The nurses took them 4 times to get the IV in her arm. It was just a miserable night. And then by ambulance, we had to go to a children's hospital so they could take it out. And I remember sitting there with Esther, and I asked her if I could tell her a story. And she said, yeah, tell me the story of David and Goliath. It was a story that she remembered. That's kind of the power of stories. They're memorable. But in addition to being memorable, I think stories move not just our mind, but also our heart. They don't just make us think, but they kind of make us feel as well. Well, we've been in a narrative section of Scripture for almost a year now. We've been going through 1st and 2nd Kings. And so what I wanted to do this morning is change it up a little bit. I wanted to tell you the story of today's passage through the eyes of somebody who may have seen it unfold. He was there, he saw what happened, and how might he tell us this story of 1 Kings 22? My name is Hamarutz. Hamarutz. It's a name my dad gave me. It's one of those names that dads give their sons that they want them to live up to. Ha means the. Marutza means runner, the runner. My dad wanted me to grow up and be a runner. But it's not the kind of runner that you typically think of. I think when we hear the word runner, we typically think somebody who runs in a race. But that's not what my dad wanted me to grow up and be. My dad wanted me to grow up and be a runner for the king. A runner was a really honorable position. A runner was somebody who ran alongside the king's chariot. It was the most honorable position you could have as part of the king's crew. You see, an Israelite chariot, there were basically 3 people in the chariot. There was a spearman. He was actually the driver of the chariot, and he had a spear with him. There was the archer, the guy who handled the bows and arrows. And then there was a shield bearer. And the shield bearer, if we came under attack and the arrows were flying, the shield bearer could kind of take cover and give us cover as we were fighting. But the runners were on the outside of the chariots. The runners were the last line of defense. In fact, the only chariots that had runners were the king's chariots. The battle pressed in, we were the last line of defense for the king. But we weren't just warriors. We didn't just battle. We didn't just fight. We were also the king's trusted advisors. When he needed to talk and to confide in people, it was the runners that he went to. So we were warriors. We were trusted advisors. But we were also the king's messengers. And it makes sense, right? We were tough. We could handle ourselves. But we also could be trusted. And so we could be trusted to take a message to somebody, and the king thought we would make it back because we were tough. That's what my dad wanted me to be. He wanted me to grow up and be a runner. My dad was a chariot driver. He served under King Omri. King Omri had a son named King Ahab, and that was my dad's dream. He wanted me to be a runner for King Ahab. Well, when Ahab became king, he kept all his dad's guys for a while. But then as time went on, as years went by, he began to appoint his own people to the different positions. And sure enough, about 11 years into his reign, he reigned for a total of 22 years, I was picked to be a runner for King Ahab. That was my job, and I loved it. I loved being able to see everything that happened in the kingdom of Israel through the eyes of the king. Wherever the king went, I got to go. Whatever the king heard, I got to listen to. Whatever the king decreed, I got to hear. And often I was the one who got to deliver the message. It was a great job. But over the last couple of weeks, I began to question whether or not that job is actually the best job. But in order to understand the last couple of weeks, I think I need to go back to the beginning. I think I need to start with when I started. You see, the first time I got to run along the chariot, I'll never forget. There had been a drought in Israel, 3 years. Some prophet of Yahweh named Elijah had told the king that there would be a drought in the land, and sure enough, there was a drought in the land. 3 years. Now, if you know anything about Israel, you know that if Israel doesn't get water, it gets dry quick. It's like a desert. The grass dries up. There's no food for the people because the crops can't grow. Not only is there no food for the people, but the animals have no food. There's no grass for the cattle to graze. There's no grass for the horses, no grass for the oxen. And as things continued to get worse and to get worse, King Ahab wanted to do something, and so he grabbed the head of his household, a guy by the name of Obadiah, and they went out to go try and find some grass for the animals. Ahab went one direction, and Obadiah went the other direction. Well, while they were out there, they didn't find any grass. But what they found was the prophet Elijah. He was back after 3 years. He wasn't just back to say hi. He was back for a battle. And so he told King Ahab, Ahab, you need to gather all the prophets of Baal and all the prophets of Asherah, and you need to meet me on Mount Carmel, and we're going to have a battle. We're going to find out who is Lord. Is it Yahweh or is it Baal? King Ahab was up for the challenge. 850 against 1. Ahab was ready. And he came back, and that's when he came to us, and he said, hey, you guys, you runners, you need to go out and take messages all over the kingdom. You go to all the cities, and you gather all the prophets of Baal and all the prophets of Asherah, and you tell them to meet us on Mount Carmel on this date. And you spread the word to all the cities. I want an audience for this. I want people to see that Baal is the Lord. And so we gathered all the people. It took a little while. It took a few weeks. But eventually one day, everybody was gathered early morning on the top of Mount Carmel. And while we were up there, I couldn't believe what I saw. 450 prophets of Baal doing everything they possibly could to get Baal to do something. And Baal didn't do anything. It didn't make any sense to me. Think of all that Ahab had done for Baal and Asherah. He had built shrines for them. He had built houses of worship for them. He had built idols for them. He had treated Baal's prophets well. If Baal was going to act on behalf of somebody, he should have acted on behalf of Ahab. He had done everything you would expect him to do. And then there was one guy, Elijah, a prophet of Yahweh. And Elijah just said the words. And Yahweh rained down fire from heaven. And all of a sudden, I think people began to realize, whoa, maybe Yahweh is Lord. The 450 prophets of Baal were taken and they were slaughtered. And I got to run alongside the chariot as we headed back to Jezreel. Ahab said we needed to go fast because rains were coming. I was like, seriously? We haven't had rain for 3 years? You're going to say the rains are coming? But Elijah had told him, by the word of the Lord, the rains are coming. And so we took off and we ran. And on that particular day, we had another runner. Elijah caught up to us, and Elijah ran along with us. Ran along with us right back to the city. It was amazing. I thought for a few days that maybe, just maybe, we were going to start building shrines and temples and statues for Yahweh. But it didn't happen. A few weeks later, Jezebel, the king's wife, came back. And Jezebel had been out. She'd been out visiting another country where her father was. And when she came back, she hadn't heard anything about what happened, but she began to hear the buzz in the town. And when she got back to the palace, Ahab said to Jezebel, this is what happened. The prophets of Baal have been defeated, not just defeated, but they've been killed by Yahweh's prophet Elijah. And Jezebel was beside herself. She said, on my life, I'm going to do to Elijah what he did to the prophets of Baal. All of a sudden, these messengers came out from the palace and said, hey, have you guys seen Elijah? Because when you see Elijah, kill him. It didn't really make sense to me, but you don't question the king's orders. You just follow the king's orders. So we were on the lookout for Elijah, but we never ran into him. Last I heard, he had headed south, way down into the southern tip of Judah. We never heard from him. Time goes by. We had the rains we needed. We had the waters we needed. Everything seemed to be going well. It was business as usual in the kingdom until about a few years later, the king of Syria decided that he really didn't like us. And so the king of Assyria gathered 32 kings from the north and the east. And these kings were going to come after and attack us. And to his credit, Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, did make us an offer. It was kind of a take it or leave it offer. He said, I will take your gold, I'll take your silver, I'll take your wives, and I'll take your children, and I'll leave you with the stuff in your house. Ahab said, okay. A few days later, he sent another messenger. And he said, not only am I going to take your wives and your children and your gold and your silver, but I'm also going to walk through all the houses and take whatever I want out of the houses. And Ahab was going to do it. I'm like, Ahab, you can't do that. And so he gathered all of us, and he gathered the elders of the city, and he said, this is the deal that is before us. And all of us were like, you can't take the deal, Ahab. And then something happened that none of us expected. Another prophet of Yahweh came by. And this prophet of Yahweh came and he said, Ahab, the Lord is going to give you victory over Ben-Hadad. Ahab asked the question all of us were wondering. How's that going to happen? And he said, you're going to go get the servants of the governors of the cities, and you're going to send the governors' servants into battle, and they're going to fight, and they're going to win. And so Ahab did. He took all of the servants of the governors, he gathered 7,000 men from Israel, and we all went into battle. And we were crushing that army. I mean, we were totally wiping them out. They came and fought on our terms. They came and fought in the hills, and we were crushing them. And as we were winning this decisive battle, that prophet showed up again, and he said, Ahab, you need to completely wipe them out, and you need to kill Ben-Hadad. Because if you don't, this is just going to replay itself next spring when the kings go to war. Ahab didn't listen to the prophet of the Lord. Abraham didn't kill Ben-Hadad. He didn't wipe out the people. He let them go. We retreated. We thought maybe that's the end of it. But sure enough, according to the word of the Lord, the next spring, they came out. Ben-Hadad came at us again, and we could hear him, the reasoning why they came out again. His prophets had told him that our God was God of the hills, but not the valleys and the plains. And so they thought if they could draw us out to the valleys and the plains, that they would be able to defeat us. And they drew us out to the valleys and the plains. We didn't know if we were going to win this time, but guess what? Another prophet of Yahweh came and talked to us. And this prophet of Yahweh said, because they question Yahweh, because they only think Yahweh is the God of the hills and not the God of the valleys and the plains and the Lord of all, you're going to beat them again. And sure enough, we went to battle in the valleys and the plains, and we beat them. We were crushing them. And the prophet said, you need to kill Ben-Hadad. But Ben-Hadad came crawling in sackcloth and ashes and asked to be spared. And so Ahab spared him. He went against the word of the Lord. And the prophet came back and he said, Ahab, because you did not listen to the word of the Lord, and you did not kill Ben-Hadad in battle, you will die in his place. Ahab, you're going to die in battle. This vexed him. I mean, every time he heard that word or that phrase, the word of the Lord, it had come to pass. Everything Elijah said, everything the prophet said in the first war, everything the prophet said in the second war, all of it had come to pass. And so when the prophet said, Ahab, you're going to die in battle, I think Ahab thought he was going to die in battle. So he went back to his summer home in Jezreel. And while we're in Jezreel, and I think to kind of get his mind off of the events that had happened and this sort of death sentence that was hanging over his head, he wanted to plant a garden. The most convenient place to plant a garden was right next to the palace. There was this sweet spot of land owned by a guy named Naboth. And so Ahab sent me over to Naboth's yard, and he said, ask him what it would cost to buy the land. And so I went over to Naboth, and I said, hey, Naboth, Ahab would like to buy this property. How much is it? And Naboth said, well, it's not for sale. This was the inheritance of my family that Yahweh gave us. It's been passed down from generation to generation. I can't give away the inheritance that Yahweh gave me. I knew Ahab wasn't going to like that news. But I went back to Ahab just like I was supposed to, and I said, Ahab, Naboth doesn't want to really sell his land. That land was his inheritance. He's not ready to give it up. This didn't make Ahab happy. He moped around for days. Jezebel saw him moping around, and Jezebel got this plan. She was going to get that land for her husband and take his mind off all that was going on. And so she wrote some letters in the king's name, put the king's seal on it, and sent it to the city leaders, and said, you need to gather a group, and you need to bring Naboth to the city gates, and you need to get some witnesses who can talk bad about him, who can trump up charges on him, and you have them say that in front of everybody, and you have him condemned to death. This is king's orders. And so everybody did it. They played that out just like it was supposed to play out, just like Jezebel had said, and they gather at the city gates, and Naboth is guilty. They take him out, and they stone him. It was the first time I'd seen a stoning. It was brutal. They buried him up to his waist, and then people just started throwing rocks at him. He died. And as he fell down, the blood just poured out of him, and dogs came and licked up his blood. It was only a few days later where we saw that prophet of Yahweh again named Elijah. Elijah came to Ahab. He said, Ahab, because this happened under your watch, because you gladly took that land that was stolen from Naboth, because justice hasn't been carried out in your land, just like Naboth, dogs will lick up your blood. There it was. By the word of the Lord, Ahab was going to have his blood licked by the dogs. Just think about the word of the Lord and what Ahab has heard to this point. Ahab, the word of the Lord says you're going to die in battle. Ahab, the word of the Lord says the dogs are going to lick up your blood just like they did with Naboth. Ahab wasn't doing real well at this point. Things weren't going well, but a few years went by. Almost 3 years went by, and you could just see over the course of weeks and months and years that Ahab had sort of lost sight of the word of the Lord. It got easier and easier not to think about what had been prophesied against him. So about 3 years later, all of us had kind of forgotten what the word of the Lord was for the life of Ahab. It just kind of goes that way. In addition to just kind of forgetting, Ahab did something that I thought was kind of smart, is he gathered more prophets, but the prophets he gathered were just prophets who would tell him what he wanted to hear. Prophets who would tell him nice things, prophets who would edify and build him up rather than confront him. It was easier that way. Time made him forget. Yes men prophets made him forget. Things were going well. But it didn't last. Things were going so well at that time that the king of the south, Jehoshaphat, was a buddy. We were getting along great with our brothers from the south. So much so that Ahab thought it would be great to have a state dinner. He invited the king from the south, Jehoshaphat, to come to this state dinner. You can imagine a state dinner. Like, we all looked forward to state dinners. He killed lots of animals, the best animals, and we had this huge feast, and because I was a runner, I got to sit at the king's table and enjoy the food. It was an awesome few days of partying. The best wine. It was great. And as we were getting close to the close of the feast, Ahab looked around, and it seemed like he was kind of addressing us, his servants, and he said, did you guys know that the Syrians still have control of the city of Ramoth Gilead? And we were thinking to ourselves, oh, wait a sec, it's been 3 years since we had any fights with the Syrians. Why are you bringing this up? It's just this small city on the far eastern border of Israel. What do you care about that? But he said it again. He goes, do you understand that they still have Ramoth Gilead? And we're like, well, yeah, I guess we did. But the reason he brought it up and the reason he had the state dinner is because he wanted to recruit Jehoshaphat to go up against the Syrians. And he said, Jehoshaphat, would you go to war with us against the Syrians? And Jehoshaphat said, I am as you. My people are your people. My horses are your horses. Of course I'll go with you. But first, could we inquire of some prophets? Could we seek the word of the Lord on this matter and see if we're supposed to go fight and take the city back? Ahab didn't really like that. I could see in his face he didn't want to go seek the word of the Lord. But rather than going and seeking the word of the Lord, he thought, well, I can give him what he wants. I'll go seek those 400 prophets I have, those yes men, those guys that tell me what I want to hear. And so it was set up. They would have this meeting, and the prophets would come and prophesy. So we moved from the party and the banquet hall. Over the next few days, we got things set up at the city gates. You imagine the city gates, and just kind of adjacent to the city gates was this threshing floor. It was kind of elevated. And so you just imagine Jehoshaphat and Ahab and all their royal regalia. They go up, and they sit on their thrones up on the threshing floor, and you have 400 prophets below. You have all the elders of the city, lots of people from the city gathered around. And Ahab said, prophesy for us. Should we go up and fight the Syrians for Ramoth Gilead? And one by one, the prophets came forward. And they said, go take Ramoth Gilead. Go fight the Syrians. The Lord will give you victory. God will give you victory if you go. Now you can imagine, prophets are like preachers. They like to hear themselves. And so they went on and on. And I mean, this went on for days. You have 400 prophets. And each of them would come forward and basically say the same thing. Go to war. God will give you victory. And as we got towards the end of all of the prophets, there was this one particular prophet that kind of stood out. A guy by the name of Zedekiah. Zedekiah came, and he didn't just come to talk to the king. He had fashioned these iron horns, and he walked in front of the king, and what he said was different too. He said, by these horns, you will drive away the Syrians. You will have Ramoth Gilead. It was like this picture of what was going to happen, but what was different about what he said is he said, by the word of Yahweh. He was the first one to use the Lord's name. Everybody else had been keeping it general, like prophesying in the name of the God. They would come up and they would say, God is going to give you victory. And the king would say, dilly dilly. And everybody would go along with it. But Zedekiah said, this is the word of the Lord. This is the word of Yahweh. Like these horns, you will drive away the Assyrians. We got to the end of the line. Jehoshaphat wasn't buying it. I could see he didn't quite trust the word of these 400 prophets. And so Jehoshaphat turned to Ahab and he said, Ahab, is there any more? Is there anybody else that we can seek the word of the Lord from? Ahab didn't like it. There was one guy left, a prophet of Yahweh. And this guy never told Ahab what he wanted to hear. Ahab said it. He said, well, there's this one guy named Micaiah, but I don't like him. Because every time he comes and talks to me, he doesn't say what I want to hear. He prophesies only bad stuff against me. But Jehoshaphat said, well, let it not be so. Go get him. And so the king looked at me and he said, Rue, go get Micaiah. So I go on a journey. I find Micaiah. I'm like, so we're walking back, Micaiah. 400 prophets, 400 have told us to go up and we can defeat the Syrians. We know we can defeat them, Micaiah. We did it twice before. We can take these guys. Would you just go stand before the king and tell him the same thing? Would you just tell him, save everybody a bunch of trouble and grief, and just tell him that we can take the city? I'm confident in our army. I know we can do it. And Micaiah looked at me with a serious look, and he said, on my life, I will only speak what Yahweh speaks. These prophets of Yahweh, they didn't care what people thought. They were committed, and all they would speak was the word of the Lord. So we get back. I present him before the kings. Micaiah is standing before the kings, and King Ahab says, Micaiah, prophesy the word of the Lord. And Micaiah says, yeah, just do what all the other prophets said. I could detect a little sarcasm in his voice. Ahab could too. And so Ahab said, Micaiah, how many times do I have to tell you, tell me the word of the Lord? And Micaiah said, this is the word of the Lord. I see sheep scattered on the hills with no shepherd. And immediately everybody knew he was prophesying Ahab's death. You're going to go to battle, the king's going to be killed, and the sheep are going to scatter with no shepherd. This didn't sit well with the king. But Micaiah wasn't done. He said, let me tell you how I know. I had this vision of heaven, and in heaven I saw Yahweh, the Lord, sitting on his throne, and all the hosts of heaven were gathered around him. And Yahweh said, how will we entice Ahab? And people were saying this, and then one guy stepped forward. He said, I will entice Ahab. And Yahweh said, how will you entice Ahab? And he said, I will give a lying spirit to his prophets, and I will lead him into battle. Zedekiah didn't like this. Zedekiah took it personal. Like he was the one with the lying spirit. And he walked over and he smacked Micaiah. He said, how dare you? How dare you say that the Spirit of the Lord isn't in me and that it's in you? Micaiah didn't flinch. He said, you'll see. Micaiah stood before the king, and King Ahab said, arrest this man and throw him in prison and only give him a little food and water. And he said, I'll deal with you, Micaiah, when I come back in peace. And Micaiah said, if you come back in peace, I have not spoken the word of the Lord. So we took Micaiah and put him in prison. Then we prepared for battle. All the chariots, all the soldiers, we all got ready. Now the king's chariot was a little bit bigger than the 3-man chariot because it needed to have 4 men, including the king. So we got the 4-man chariot ready, and just as we were getting ready to go into battle, where the king would usually get all his royal fighting gear on, Ahab said, wait, I'm going to dress like a normal soldier. Just in case the word of the Lord is true, I don't want to be identified as the king, because I know the king of Assyria is going to send his guys directly after the king of Israel. But he told Jehoshaphat, you stay in your king stuff, as he's thinking like they're going to mistake the king of Judah for the king of Israel. Well, sure enough, the battle starts, and the best of the Syrians comes straight after the king of Judah, thinking it was the king of Israel. They go right after Jehoshaphat. And from what I hear, Jehoshaphat cried out to Yahweh, and they turned. They recognized him as the king of Judah, and these mighty men of Syria turned around, and they went back. So we're over here on the other flank, and we think we're doing fine. We don't see anything coming. Soldiers are taking care of it in front. And all of a sudden, I turn around, and I see an arrow in Ahab. It had hit the perfect spot, right between the breastplates. They were hanging down, and there was the smallest opening where an arrow could hit. And a random arrow from a random soldier had hit Ahab, and he began to bleed. And Ahab said, get me out of the battle. Get me out of the battle. I'm wounded. And so we took the chariot and we ran it back to the outskirts of the battle. We propped him up so that he could see how everything played out. He continued to bleed. And as sunset came, we heard these words. Everyone scatter. Everyone go back to their cities. Everyone go back to their countries. And as I looked and saw the people scattered, I thought, the word of the Lord has come to pass. We got Ahab and we tried to get him back to the city in time to get some help, but he bled out. The chariot was just filled with blood. We took him back to Samaria so that he could have a king's funeral. And after we dropped him off, we took the chariot to the pool of Samaria. We began to wash out the blood, began to lap the water in and dish it out. And as we're doing it, I looked up, and there were dogs licking his blood. And I thought, the word of the Lord has come to pass. If I look back over the 11 years of serving King Ahab, I used to think the most honorable thing I could do, the best thing I could do in life, was to be a runner for the king. But as I look back and see the word of the Lord come to pass, and the word of the Lord come to pass, and the word of the Lord come to pass, I'm thinking if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't run with the king. I'd run with the prophets. Because the word of the Lord always comes to pass. Let's pray.